Welcome everyone, and I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on unceded Algonquin territory, and we're very grateful for that. I would like to, before we get to our witnesses today from the Friendship Center, Association of Friendship Centers, I want to just get the sense from members. We only have one organization visiting today, so it leaves us a little bit of time on our agenda. What I'd like to propose to do with the order of questions is what we did on Tuesday, which is complete the first order and repeat, and then go to the second page and do the top half of the 7-minute questions, and then wherever that leaves us, we'll leave there, and then we can proceed into two pieces of committee business on the draft suicide study budget and communications plan. Does that seem reasonable to everybody? Looks like I see assent there. Okay, so with that decided, I'm very happy to welcome on behalf of the committee today Christopher Shepard, Vice President of the National Association of Friendship Centers, and Yancey Craig, Director of Strategic Development. Christopher has traveled to see us today from St. John's, Newfoundland, and Yancey Craig has traveled across the street to see us, so we welcome you both and very happy to have you here. I am happy to offer you 10 minutes between you to divide amongst yourselves as you would see fit. When 9 minutes comes along, I'm going to hold up the yellow card, and when 10 minutes is up, I'm going to hold up the red card, and I'd ask you to please bring it right to a close at that point so that we can get to the questions. So without further ado, I cede the floor to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, distinguished members of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. It's an honor and privilege to appear before you again today. I thank you for this opportunity to share with you the work of the Friendship Center movement and the National Association of Friendship Centers relative to the issues of suicide among Indigenous peoples and communities. Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge the Algonquin Nation, upon whose traditional territory we're meeting today. As you may recall from my previous appearance before the committee, my name is Christopher Shepard. I'm an Inuk from Northern Labrador, and I now live and work in St. John's, Newfoundland. I grew up in the Friendship Center movement, became actively involved in the Aboriginal Youth Council, and I'm now currently the Vice President of the National Association of Friendship Centers, also known as the NAFC. Throughout my career within Friendship Centers, the topic and concerns of suicide have been constant, even after I left my home community in the north and I moved south. Accompanying me today is Mr. Yancey Craig, NAFC's Director of Strategic Development. With our brief time together, I would like to give you a brief overview of the Friendship Center movement, the NAFC, and the urban Indigenous population of Canada. I would also like to share with you some of the programs and supports of Friendship Centers and the NAFC in regards to suicide prevention within urban Indigenous communities. And of course, time permitting, I will do my best to respond to the questions that you may have. I would like to begin by sharing some facts with you to set the context for the work of the Friendship Center movement. As you may know, 75% of Canada's Indigenous people live off reserve. Nearly 60% live in urban areas. Further, the Indigenous population is growing at a faster rate than the Canadian average. This means that there are approximately 840,000 Indigenous people living in Canadian cities. The Canadian Indigenous population is also very young, with approximately 50% under the age of 24. This presents a tremendous opportunity for Canada's future social, cultural, and economic development. Amongst this growing demographic, there is a growing need for mental health supports being observed. Current estimates suggest that 15% of young Canadians between the ages of 14 and 24 cope with some form of anxiety, depression, addictions, or other social distresses. While estimates among Indigenous populations are twice the national average, with addictions and suicide being 5 to 6 times the national average. Friendship Centers know this firsthand and have identified the need for additional strategies and capacity for mental health programs for urban Indigenous communities, especially among youth. I would like to share with you, as I shared with you during my previous appearance, Friendship Centers emerged beginning in the 1950s out of the need for Indigenous people migrating to urban centers to have a friendly and welcoming space to gather and to express their culture. For over half a century, Friendship Centers have helped urban Indigenous people access the vital services they need to succeed in urban settings across Canada. Friendship Centers understand the challenges facing our communities, and with their unique wraparound service delivery model, we ensure that we are well equipped to tackle them. Across the country, Friendship Centers provide culturally appropriate services for Indigenous people living in urban centers and have become a place for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to come together, share traditions, and learn from one another. Friendship Centers are a significant part of Canada's social infrastructure, with more than 2 million client contacts annually, serving Canada's most vulnerable urban Indigenous populations, making the Friendship Centre movement the country's most significant off-reserve Indigenous service delivery infrastructure. The NAFC was created in 1972 to be the voice of its members nationally and internationally. The NAFC's membership is now comprised of 7 provincial and territorial associations and 118 member Friendship Centres across the country in each of your ridings. The NAFC has a long and unique relationship with the Government of Canada, and for the past 30 years, the NAFC has been the administrator of national programs delivered to Friendship Centres and other urban Indigenous organizations on behalf of the Government of Canada. While we are a not-for-profit network rather than a politically representative organization, the NAFC enjoys a productive relationship with many other Indigenous organizations. The effects of colonization and residential schools have led to high levels of psychological distress within Indigenous communities, elders and youth. No one is immune to those effects. This is not just a concern for Indigenous people living on reserve, but those in Canada's urban centres as well. Statistics Canada's report on lifetime suicidal thoughts among First Nations living off reserve, Métis, and Inuit aged 26 to 59, prevalence and associated characteristics, found that 1 in 5 off-reserve Indigenous adults have contemplated suicide, and recent reports have shown that this number is continually growing. In one Friendship Centre mental health program alone, over 50% of all current clients have a risk factor for suicide. Many Indigenous people prefer cultural and heritage-based services that are offered outside of the mainstream medical system. This often includes harboring a more holistic view of mental health and its treatments. Friendship Centre programming is exactly that. Friendship Centres support culturally safe delivery of these much-needed services in innovative ways. Many centres have health outreach workers to ensure that the health needs of community members are addressed in a cultural and holistic way that addresses the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of individuals. These services are available on a one-to-one basis or in a group setting where action plans are developed to help meet short and long-term goals of participants. There are also healing and wellness programs at Friendship Centres that provide support to community members seeking to assess traditional services and supports where action plans are also developed to help meet the goals of community member. Friendship Centres with addictions and mental health programs offer a cultural space for individuals with mental health and addictions issues to help find the help they need in moving towards a healthier lifestyle. The program also works to make better connections between urban Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous health services. This is done by educating non-Indigenous staff about the specific needs of Indigenous people and creating partnerships to connect them with the Friendship Centre. Many Friendship Centres also have elder and youth programs providing the opportunity for open and honest discussions around the topics of healthy lifestyles, where elders share their experiences as survivors of the residential school system and other topics that youth may be too intimidated to ask. These are but a few examples of how Friendship Centres help heal our communities, but more needs to be done. Many of our centres do not have the funds or capacity for clinical mental health services, as we have seen with the tragic events in La Loche, Cross Lake, and too many other communities. Friendship Centres are heavily relied upon for their unique support programs. The NAFC has taken on efforts promoting healing and wellness in our communities. In 2012, the NAFC's Aboriginal Youth Council embarked on a suicide prevention and awareness project for urban Aboriginal youth aged 10 to 24. This included a proposal and call-out for a suicide prevention kit and resulted in much-needed research on Indigenous youth and mental health. More recently, the NAFC launched newjourneys.ca, an online Friendship Center resource. New Journeys is home to a unique online searchable database that lists programs and services for Indigenous people across the country. The site also features engaging stories, news articles, and blog posts written by mostly Indigenous youth. As part of the development of New Journeys, the NAFC has partnered with Kids Help Phone. This partnership has not only allowed the NAFC to refer Indigenous children and youth to a critical emergency service, it has also allowed Kids Help Phone to become more responsive to the unique needs of Indigenous callers. The Friendship Center movement will continue to support individuals and communities and is a willing partner in suicide prevention and mental health. The Friendship Center movement and the NAFC looks forward to working with the government and opposition parties to improve the lives of Indigenous people in Canada. This will be achieved through core funding investments in Friendship Centers so that they continue to have the capacity to operate and to meet the needs of their communities, as well as looking at ways that Friendship Centers can expand their current successful programs that support individuals affected by suicide. In closing, I would like to reaffirm that there are community-based solutions to complex problems like suicide, and Friendship Centers work every day to harness the creativity, energy, and knowledge that can unlock new ideas and new thinking that will lead to enduring social change and contribute to the healing and full inclusion of Indigenous people in Canada's economic, cultural, and social fabric. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you today, and myself and Mr. Craig look forward to addressing any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Shepherd, and I'm very proud of the work that the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center in Halifax does in my own community as well. We're going to go right into the first round of 7-minute questions, and as you'll recall, we'll use the same yellow card for 1 minute, red card for time's up. And the first question is from Michael McLeod, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the presenters today. This is an interesting presentation and something that I'm quite interested in and was historically very much involved in. I'm one of the founding members for several friendship centers, or at least one friendship center in the Northwest Territories, but worked on several projects that resulted in friendship centers being established. Spent a lot of time at the national level trying to convince people that we needed more friendship centers in the North. And I did that because I saw the benefit of friendship centers. I've worked as band managers, I've managed band councils, I've been involved with the Métis, so I've been involved with the political organizations quite extensively. And I always found that the restrictions to serving only members was too confining. We needed an agency in the community that dealt with everybody on an equal basis. And friendship centers really fit that bill for us. And I've seen the community really benefit from the programs in many different areas. Language development, we've seen cultural programs where drum making programs were established. We had elders come in and talk about history. We've seen community gardens being worked on, so it provided food for the community. We've seen services provided out of the facility, a facility that was built out of logs, and people are still wondering why we built it out of logs, but that was the only resources we had. And it's not very energy efficient, but it still serves its purpose. And we've also seen a lot of good programs like Mums and Tots and programs that you would think everybody has the skill to like for dealing with children and young babies. You think everybody would know how to handle situations, but those things have to be taught in communities now because of the residential school syndrome. There's a lot of people that don't have that skill. And we had courses put on about FASD. There's sports programs run through there. There's alcohol and drug programs and so many others. You know, it served as a drop-in center for all these years, and it's also worked as a homeless shelter because there's nowhere else to put people that have no place to go. So I wanted to ask you, I got several questions, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about the funding gaps, about what programs you're not addressing because you don't have the resources. I know the cuts in the friendship centers for last while have been pretty drastic. I know it's kind of cooled off all the programs that were needed. And I also know that there's really been nothing in the area of infrastructure funding for putting facilities in place. And you talk about people that are living off reserve, but in the Northwest Territories, we don't have reserve. So friendship centers serve us well there. It's there for everybody. But maybe talk about the gaps first, and then I'll ask a couple other questions.
Thank you. So in the last few years, the funding program that supports friendship centers has gone through what I would say is a fundamental shift. Once upon a time, friendship centers received their money through the Minister of State. It transitioned to the Aboriginal Friendship Center program, and then most recently into the Community Capacity Support program, which falls under the Urban Aboriginal Strategy. The AFCP program that no longer exists was a program designed for friendship centers based on the 40, 50-year history between friendship centers and the Government of Canada. That has led to I would say, substantial shift in how friendship centers are. We used to have, say, core funding. It's no longer core funding. And that fundamental shift has really changed the way that friendship centers are able to operate. Questions around our eligible expenses like receptionists, and I try to explain to people what a friendship center receptionist is like. So I'll give you the experience of, say, my friendship center where I come from. We have a mental health team that consists of a social worker, clinical psychologist, cultural support workers, elder. So that receptionist isn't just saying, hello, friendship center, how can I direct your call? Sometimes it's, hello, there's a person in serious distress on the other line, and how do you prioritize that work? Is it someone that needs to speak to someone right now? Is it someone that can wait an hour? So a receptionist isn't just someone picking up a phone and saying hello. They could be the first one to deal with a huge emergency. They could be the first one to make sure someone gets the help that they need. So for us, the idea of having, say, no receptionist in a friendship center isn't just about someone picking up the phone. It's about whether someone will get the help they need in the amount of time that they need. And so the fundamental shift around how friendship centers are funded has been quite significant. And it's something that I know the last time we were here, we presented on, and we would love to engage with anyone in the room around that. But there has been a fundamental shift in how friendship centers are supported, and it creates huge challenges. And one thing that we hear from the North is that funding a friendship center in the North is very different than funding a friendship center even in St. John's. I come from the North. I know exactly what that looks like, the costs associated with being able to have a building open and available.
Okay,
And
I think you made your point, because I want to ask another question before I get cut off. In my opinion, every community that has an Aboriginal population, or every community that has huge social issues, should have a friendship center. I think they have a very valuable purpose. I would ask you if you agree with that line of thinking.
I think, so a few years ago, we actually did some data working with Statistics Canada around the communities where there should be a friendship center. And it is significantly different than where we are right now. For instance, in my province, there should be 9. There are 2. And we look at it as the number of Aboriginal individuals in a community and some of the other concerns in that community. But it is very different. The difference is that in the 70s and 80s, there was funding available if you wanted to start a friendship center.
Okay, I have one more question. Are you currently engaged in the review that's taking place right now?
I get reviewed next Thursday.
All right, thanks. Next question from David Yurdiga, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. I do have a great passion for friendship centers. I'm not sure how the communities will be without them. I have 3 friendship centers in my riding. You know what? Over the years, friendship centers have evolved. Before they're a place to meet, now they're a place for refuge, for counseling. I know some of them even have food banks within their organization. So it's much appreciated. And even some municipalities are even helping with the cost far as giving them a grant per year. So it's a necessity that we all recognize is it has to be supported in a greater capacity. And for many Indigenous people, friendship centers are the first point of contact. And whether it's social economic programs and services, I know even some for friendship centers even have employment courses and resumes development and that sort of thing. So it's much appreciated. So the question I have what kind of funding would make the friendship centers be able to complete their mandate? And I'm sure every friendship's a little different, but in every community, it seems to like the mental health issues is a big thing. So can you describe what funding is necessary, like the magic number that will be able to carry your guys' mandate out?
So we've done some work around, so we always ask friendship centers, how much money do you really need to do what you're doing? So a lot of friendship centers are very good at leveraging money. So on average, if you receive 120 to 170,000 in core-like funding or whatever, they're really spending on average over 300 to make sure that they're still able to hire the people they need and to still have the space that they're doing. So well over double what is being received now. But the reality for friendship centers in this moment is we don't have a friendship center funding program. It is open to anyone that meets the criteria can apply, which I'm totally open to. But at the same time, if we want to recognize the work that is expected of a friendship center and to fund them at a level that's appropriate, it's nowhere near what the current number is. And so 43 million in total, it's way bigger than that. And when you say numbers like over 2 million client contacts a year, it's significant. So in St. John's, it's 33,000 a year in multiple areas. So they're really good. And this is the thing I try to tell people is providing funding to a friendship center isn't just here you go and you'll keep doing what you're doing and you'll do the baseline work. When you're leveraging it at 1 to 7 for every dollar that you're getting from the federal government for your core-like funding, there are very few organizations in this country that can say that an organization can leverage at that level. So every dollar shouldn't be looked at as this is the dollar you're getting. It's these are the additional dollars that you can get. So it is, the last time I was here, I presented and I said it's around double what we're already getting. To really support friendship centers to do what they need to do, because right now they're moving along, applying for every cent that they can, creating their own revenue to make sure, because when someone does walk through our doors, regardless of who they are, what background they're from, most of them are in really busy downtown parts of your city, you help them. If it's an Aboriginal person, you help them. If it's a non-Aboriginal person, you help them. Because at the end of the day, they need that support. And so they're doing all this work, but really, really on very little money.
Thank you for that. Right now, the biggest thing right now is addressing the suicide among our youth. And I see that even in my riding, from one friendship center to another, they have a different program. So my question is, does your national association have a program that you can share among all friendship centers? Is there a certain minimum guidelines you have, or do you have one, or are you guys working on a national strategy that can be shared with other friendship centers?
So because there is really no central pot of funding for a suicide program or even mental health in that matter, every center's response is based on the capacity that they have. And the friendship center that I mentioned, where 50% of the mental health clients have a risk of suicide, half of the money is coming from Health Canada. The other half is being paid for by the friendship center itself because no one is able to fund it. So to be able to do it, they realized how important it is, but there is no funding. So every friendship center's reaction or availability of programs is different depending on what resources they have access to. Our biggest, I guess, centralized effort around it is especially sort of strong in the youth council. This is something that came up when I was on the youth council, and we looked at a strategic plan and we asked young people across the country, and this came up as a huge risk factor. So they said, develop a proposal, shop it around, we need to do something about this, and we were never able to get traction on it. As huge as an issue as it is, we were never able to sort of create a centralized effort, because depending on which province you're in or what city, there are different resources available. And a lot of the times they're supplementing it with their own money.
Less than a minute. Another thing I noticed is some of these friendship centers are very resourceful. They go after funding from industry. They have bingos, and they have other things that they do to raise money. And some of them are doing an excellent job on providing mental health services. But like you said, it all depends on where they can draw the revenue from. And do you think that the federal government should have a funding-specific program just for mental health issues?
I think if we want to make a difference in how mental health is looked at and treated in Canada, especially in Indigenous communities, I don't think there's really another option.
Okay, thanks. Nikki, Ashley, next question, please.
Great. Thanks so much for being here today, and thank you for the important work that you do. I'm very proud of the work that the 4 friendship centers in our constituency in northern Manitoba do, and it strikes me that oftentimes, friendship centers are really the only option for so many young people in our communities, but also for young people that come in from the neighboring First Nations, whether it's, visiting family or coming to school for a few months. And really it's the friendship center that's there for them. And the first thing I wanted to say, and I know, there's a robust discussion around the needs for mental health supports in communities, and I'd certainly like to hear your thoughts on that. But one of the discussions I know that came up post the suicide crisis in Pimicikamat Cree Nation, or Cross Lake in northern Manitoba, was kids wanting access to recreation services. And in fact, Amber Muskego, a very articulate and courageous young woman who came out and talked about the lack of recreation services, as she was talking to me one-on-one, said, why don't we have something like a friendship center? Because she knew of the friendship center in Thompson. And so, how important do you think that there be recreation services in First Nations, and obviously this being clear federal jurisdiction, how important is it for the federal government to support recreation services on First Nations as a way of preventing suicide?
So maybe I'll give some personal background of myself. So I'm originally from an isolated Inuit community in the north, lived there for 17 years. Super strong recreation community. Most of the communities in my area have very strong recreation and sport programs, very strong after-school programs. And it was one of the sort of more shocking, I guess, realities when I moved, and to see communities that don't have that. So, and I'm from a community that isn't a reserve. We have an Inuit government, we have a self-government, so we don't face some of those sort of challenges. But one thing I have noticed, especially it's even relatable to the city, when you have young people that have nowhere to go, nothing to do, nowhere safe to be, and all these other barriers that are piling up, it is not difficult to see how you go down this road of, and I like to remind people that suicide, a lot of people, I used to be a suicide intervention trainer. It was such a huge concern for our friendship center that's what I did. I trained young people, individuals, in how to keep someone alive long enough to get them to someone who could really change their circumstances. And so, recreation and the safe space and the ability for these young people to have somewhere to go is life-changing. Most friendship centers have youth programs, after-school programs where they can go. That doesn't mean that there aren't other barriers that are challenging, and when these small things all pile up, sometimes that's what it takes to get a young person to that place. But if there's nowhere for them to go and talk to someone about that, We've done suicide interventions over Facebook Messenger. We've done them through email. We've had young people walk through the door. And it was such a huge concern that even with after-school programming and everything else, there will still be those challenges. But recreation is a game changer, a safe place for people to go and do an amazing activity. But for those of you who work in community or have had community experience, recreation is also another area that is challenging to fund. We have friendship centers that self-fund volleyball teams for young people and access to sports. Access to recreation is so challenging, but it can be a huge game changer because it provides that safe place for young people to go and have something to do when maybe they don't even have a safe home to go to. And so, we always looked at recreation as it's so much more than just an activity. It's team building, it's building self-confidence, it's all these things wrapped into one. And trying to explain that to a lot of people is really challenging because they don't get it or they've never worked in that area. I worked in youth programming at a friendship center. I did it for 3 years. I see the difference it can make when young people have something that they can do. And access it's really challenging everywhere. And so when I see communities that don't have access to that, I find it really shocking that you don't even have a safe recreation space to go to.
Well, thank you for sharing that and for infusing your own personal experience as well. It makes it definitely more powerful. I did want to refer to a news release that was put out in the early May by the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres with respect to, in fact, they refer to facing a dire crisis and particularly the ongoing delay and uncertainty of the Urban Aboriginal Strategy funding from the department. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that and what the current situation is and what needs to be done if at this point.
So right now as you know, a portion of UAS sunsetted March 31st of this previous year. It was recommitted in the current budget. It has not been released yet. It has not been released to the NAFC or friendship centers yet. So as of this point, no friendship center has received their core funding. And so any friendship center that's currently open is running off of other revenue or other resources to keep their staff and to keep their doors open. We've been working as closely as we can with department officials to have it released and to have it drawn down. But right now it still hasn't happened.
Do you have a timeline? Have they given you a timeline? I mean, this is pretty shocking.
Yancy can answer that one.
Thank you. Yes, we were asked by the department to adjust our submission to move forward to get to our contribution agreement, which was required because of the authority's change coming from the budget commitment, and we remade our submission yesterday. So we're quite hopeful that we'll get some feedback and that funds will flow very, very quickly, but we haven't received a response to that submission yet.
We're out of time there. Thank you for that. The next question is from Mike Wasio, please.
Yeah, thank you both so much for being here again, Christopher. Great to see you. You certainly enlighten us because we hear so much about the reserve side of life for Indigenous peoples in this country, and yet the most of the population is urban, off reserve. Now, friendship centers, I'm just trying to get my head around a few things. So friendship centers are primarily urban, correct? Because I know I have a rural riding. I don't have any friendship centers in my riding. I do have a few larger towns, but they don't have a friendship center, although I would surmise they probably could use one. How many friendship centers are there across the country?
118.
118. Most of them in major urban centers like your St. John's, Ottawa, Toronto, etc., right? And the total funding?
43 million.
Okay, so I thought I heard you say that earlier, but I wanted to verify. So 43 million, and you're able to take and if I heard you correctly earlier, every $1 of funding you translate into was $7 worth of services.
That was our calculation from the 2014-15 fiscal year. I believe it's been as high as 12. Part of the sources of funding are provincial governments for some services for some friendship centers. So, of course, some of that funding varies based on priorities that change for different provincial governments as well.
So the funding. So when you're calculating that model, you're of course you've got a very large volunteer contingent, I assume, that is wrapped into that. Is there what other sources of funding do you get other than the province?
So one, for example, the core is 160. The total annual budget of that center is about $2 million. 450 is own source revenue, social economy, social enterprise. Another portion would be private. So a lot of friendship centers have private or support from private industry, businesses. Others are municipal money, foundations. Literally, if you walk into a friendship center, they're probably writing a grant for something. And
so you get an army of grant writers as well. So of course, if you could use those resources in a more effective way, it would certainly help you deliver more services. I guess is part of what I'm getting at. It is, once again, we hear about suicide and the crisis that exists in the north. And I deeply empathize with that. Is it as big a crisis in the friendship centers on the off-reserve side? I heard you say 1 in 5 contemplate it, but
for us, I try to use like real-world examples. So if you're an Indigenous person in a city, and I'll speak from an actual example of I experienced. If you're an Indigenous person in a city and you take someone to, say, the emergency department of a mental health hospital, which I've done, and the first question you get from a psychiatrist is, does your government pay for anything for you? So I have a young Aboriginal person who has made a suicide attempt that day, and the question is, does your government pay for anything? Instead of, okay, what do we need to do right now? What do we need to do today? How do we get you into a service or program?
So, and this is exactly once again where I'm going. You've found out ways to deliver services in a much more cost-effective way than our provinces, the federal government, all of them. And a lot of it is born out of necessity, desperation, in some instances. And you were talked earlier about training people to deal with suicide crisis situations. How long does it take you to train somebody to deal with that?
So for me to become a trainer, it took a week straight, and you live like where you're doing it for the week. And so there are different levels. So for us, because it is a prevalent issue, we also have a homeless shelter in our friendship center as a part of one of our services. So we try to make sure every employee is trained. It takes around 2.5 days to do the full-blown, okay, this is how you, and the big thing is, like, we try to tell people, like, this is about keeping someone alive until you can get them to an appropriate program or service or the hospital or someone. Because a lot of the times, people don't know how to react when someone comes to your door or calls you and says, like, this is happening, this is what it is.
Ever work with on-reserve organizations in order to transfer those types of skills so that they are, once again, to me, the big issue, one of the big part of the issue is we're not delivering the services where they need to be, and that is in the community itself, and it's not being delivered by Indigenous individuals within those communities. A lot of times it's outside individuals that don't understand the cultural, historical, or residential school perspective, right, they're dealing with. So do you find that you're able to do that, or is it really on reserve, off reserve?
It's on reserve, off reserve. We try, and the reason I became trained, I don't do it anymore because it's really hard to do that every day, but we have other staff that are, now taking over that piece. But the reason we had our own staff trained who are Aboriginal was so that when you work with Aboriginal clients, there's a better understanding of all the other things that happened. And so that we could do it for all of our staff so that all of our clients at least have access to someone who understands what that looks like. And it was really important to us not to bring people in all the time from the outside and train our staff all the time. Why couldn't we just do it ourselves? Because it does make a significant difference. It's no different than employment programs or anything else.
Okay, so and you've outlined a lot of challenges that exist that you're trying to deal with. A lot of them are funding challenges, but if you had an ideal world from a funding standpoint, but also more importantly from a tools standpoint, what would you say the top 3 issues that you would like to deal with immediately?
I think a standardized process or the ability to develop a standardized piece for organizations, whether, and I mean, on reserve and off reserve are very different, but the process to get there is the same. You want to work with the people in the community, get them there. So a tool, or the ability to create a tool that people can actually use and understand how to use it. I guess second would be, you know, a clear idea of where you go to get this support. You know, you tell people all, you get handed a piece of paper and handed whatever. And third, I would say more awareness that this is an issue.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. We're going to the 5-minute questions now, and the first question comes from Arnold Viersen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here again today. One point of clarification: are friendship centers charities?
Many of them are registered charities. Yes.
Okay, so it's not like a national organization; they're all individual.
Right. So the National Association, our office at the NEFC, is incorporated federally.
Okay.
So we fall under the National Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. Okay. But then individual centers are generally incorporated in their province or territory, and most of them are registered charities.
Okay, yeah, because I have three friendship centers in my riding, and they seem to be registered with Alberta. Like they seem to be Alberta friendship centers. So okay, that's clarifying that for me.
I could clarify that part of that is we have a federated structure, so there are 7 provincial and territorial associations.
Oh, okay.
So that would explain that in Alberta.
Okay, yeah, this is. In my own research on suicide, especially in Indigenous communities, but just broadly, I can't. It's a lot of time suicide becomes just one identifier, and it doesn't necessarily break it out into non-Indigenous versus Indigenous, and I don't really like to deal with it as non-Indigenous versus Indigenous. So I deal with it just generally, what are the underlying causes for suicide attempts and things like that, and they're kind of linked. And so one of a major driver seems to be child abuse or sexual assault, some sort of combination of those. Would that characterize your experience with suicide attempts? Is there it seems to be like 25 to 30% of attempt cases or successful cases of suicide, there seems to have been some underlying sexual assault or child abuse issues. Would that characterize your experiences?
I mean, every person I've worked with or have, say, done an intervention with is very different. One person might be able to, you know, be okay with experiencing some of those pieces. Then you have someone who, you know, has a hard time finding a job, suffers from addiction, can't find a place to live, doesn't have a whole lot of support. Or you could have someone that has one catastrophic event or thing happen to them. In my experience, I've never been able to sort of characterize them, except for every person has dealt with those situations differently and their ability to manage that. One thing I think is really difficult for non-Indigenous Canadians to understand is when a non-Indigenous Canadian dies by suicide, it is a huge shock. In the entire community, it is a big thing, and it should be. When a young Indigenous person or an Indigenous person dies by suicide, it is another one. And this has always been a challenge for me, is because it has happened so often. In my region of the country, we had one of the highest rates of suicide in the world when I was a teenager. I was in one community where there were 3 suicides in 1 week. And when you work with a young woman who has lost 20 members of her family to suicide, it isn't the same outcry as the general population when it comes to people dying by suicide. And people say, well, how did you normalize it? Why did you normalize it? You don't really have another option if you want to keep your mental capacity intact. It's really challenging to get through those situations. And so for non-Indigenous Canadians, I find it's difficult because you haven't had to live through it over and over again. And it's not like, you fly in mental health counselors and they're gone 5 days later. Or we're able to get someone into the hospital because we've had a string of suicides in the city, but then there's no other support. So, or you're told that, well, you're Aboriginal, someone else should be giving you a psychiatrist instead of coming to the main health center. So there's this huge separation between non-Indigenous Canadians understanding the reality of suicide for Indigenous people. And that, well, why is this such a mystery? Well, I mean, you look at all the underlying points and all the barriers that people face every day, and it's not that difficult to start to piece together why you would have trouble thinking of continuing to live. You have nowhere to sleep, you have no food, no one seems to care about helping you get a job, and that's your life. That's what you live every day.
I'm sorry, Arnold, that's we're out of time there. Yeah. Next question from Gary and Anna Sangre, please.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherd, for coming back to us again. Just have a couple of questions. First, with respect to your experience in an urban setting, what would you say the top 3 things that we as governments and through you as organizations need to do in order to address this issue in a meaningful way?
I'd say the first big one is supporting organizations at a realistic level to offer the services that they need to offer. 2, working, and some of the federal government departments do really amazing work in some of these areas. We have friendship centers that have amazing relationships with Health Canada and other areas where they're able to get a portion of the funds or project money to do this kind of work. It's just that the resources are limited. Second, I would think infrastructure money is amazing. Infrastructure money that makes a huge difference to people in urban settings is even more amazing. So, for instance, housing. We know that housing on reserve and in the north is a huge issue. Well, you can imagine how challenging it is for an Indigenous person in an urban setting to have housing. We have a homeless shelter. We do because it was a necessity, and we have Aboriginal people who have nowhere to live. And unless you make a certain amount of money, you may never find a suitable place to live. And so infrastructure money, maybe around housing, transitional housing, something. We do emergency housing. We would love to do transitional housing to help people. We do all this other work, but housing is a huge thing for us. And 3, I think, is providing real support for urban Aboriginal young people. Historically, we were able to deliver another federal program that no longer exists that was focused around urban Indigenous young people, and it had some of the indicators are mind-blowing. And the work and you'll hear about it if you Google Cultural Connections for Aboriginal Youth or UMAYC, you'll see some of the amazing work that has done across the country in friendship centers and out of friendship centers, because it was delivered across the country in various, through various organizations and even through departments themselves. That was an amazingly successful program that created a lot of amazing young Indigenous people across the country. I'm one of the people that came out of that, attending a Friendship Center program and supporting them to get to a place where they can, be successful, and it no longer exists. And this is the thing, when you have successful programs that no longer exist, it's kind of disappointing.
So coming back to, you mentioned about some of the work that our departments do, and you said there are some good programs. What would be a couple that are directly linked to suicides that you think that's maybe regional and that could be expanded to other parts of the country?
So there's some work being done through some of the residential school money, through IRS and some of the other funds. There's some, one of the biggest successes I've seen, besides say the Indian residential school money and being able to support those people and the broader community, has been transportation. Some of the work with Health Canada or First Nation Inuit Health Branch and enabling transportation to programs is huge. Transportation is a huge barrier in pretty much every community. So when people are able to get to things, it makes a huge difference. And I mean, allowing, and I think it would be important to look across the different areas that do Aboriginal funding, urban Aboriginal funding, and see, there are some really amazing success stories with some amazing people working in them. And many friendship centers have relationships with, even Aboriginal or Indigenous affairs regionally that are amazing. But sometimes it doesn't feel like that flows all the ways up sometimes. And sometimes it feels like you understand what it is in the community, you understand what it is regionally, but then when it gets to the national piece, it doesn't exist. And those relationships aren't there.
So the consistency then. Getting to education, what type of supports do you offer towards education attainment? I know it's a very complex issue, but
it depends on which friendship center you go to.
Right.
So if you go to the friendship center in Halifax, they do upgrading, GEDs, acquiring a high school certificate, working towards training, and other friendship centers have alternative schools. So it really depends on the relationship they have provincially around education and what you're able to do. So it depends.
We're out of time there, Gary. Thanks. Next question comes from Kathy McLeod, please.
Thank you. And first of all, I know that we're here to discuss the issue of suicide prevention and that horrific, thing that you have to deal with all the time. But I have to go back because I'm actually quite stunned. The one thing I've heard agreement on at this table is that we're all amazed at what friendship centers do. I have a friendship center in my riding. The building is not very great, but it has people with passion who do an absolutely phenomenal job, and I will admit on a shoestring budget. The funding issue does disturb me, though, because the minister was here on May the 5th, and she was asked about that question, and in terms of what's happening with the funding. And at that time, she says there is funding for friendship centers, which is secure. Over the last 2 years, they've been administering the whole of the UAS. Now, I think you were only doing 43 out of 50 million of it, but it's not the whole. But so she says the money's booked. All they have to do is sign the contribution agreement to get the money to flow. I remember in the Friendship Center where I was many years ago, they were doing pink slips in April because they didn't know if the money was flowing or not. They didn't have the money. So what I'm hearing is the money's not there. So first of all, perhaps you can clarify, is it because you haven't signed the contribution agreement? Is it because the minister said that on May 5th. I mean, we're a couple months into the fiscal year. Are pink slips, happening in some of your friendship centers?
I'll take a portion, you take a portion. So I'll take the money was
I believe that the minister is correct in that the authority for the department for the funding exists post-budget. And we've been in discussions with the public servants that manage the program, and they've requested us to reconfigure our contribution agreement. We had to produce a new work plan because of the way the authorities for the renewal of the funds as announced in budget have come to fruition, and we had to pull a lot of extra information together as part of that request. And as I said earlier, we made our submission yesterday. So we understand that once we've sort of met the lens through which it's being viewed at the bureaucratic level, that we'll move very quickly toward a funding agreement, and then we will indeed be able to flow the funds from the national office as we administer the $43 million portion.
So in the meanwhile, were you given emergency money? Were you given anything, or have friendship centers been laying off staff?
Some friendship centers, we understand, in some areas are either have or are at risk of losing staff. Part of the challenge, I think, was a lot of the concern around the sunsetting of a large portion of the funds made everyone quite anxious for the budget announcement. Of course, that happened later in the usual cycle than would have happened normally. Normally, towards the end of the calendar year, we'd be going through the applications and calls for proposal processes to maintain continuity of funding for the new fiscal year starting April 1st. And that, of course, has caused delays because of the sort of waiting for the budget announcement of the confirmation of funds.
Okay. the minister at the time indicated that because friendship centers aren't the only organization providing services for urban Aboriginal, that you were responsible for the entire fund. So how much has been cut back in terms of what is going to flow through your friendship centers? And is that going to be impacting any of the programs, such as some of the work you're doing around suicide prevention?
Our understanding is that we're going to receive the full 43 million, so it won't be a cutback in funds. The issue is the delay that we've been experiencing as we've been adjusting to the new requirements. But as I say, we're hopeful that that will be resolved soon. And yes, it will have an impact. It is having an impact. Chris can speak to the impact perhaps even more directly than I could.
So a lot of friendship centers have, not just, operation programming or whatever. They have a lot of other programs and services. And a lot of the times, this isn't the only delay in funding. A lot of friendship centers have other programs that are also delayed. And so it's really challenging to keep employees when you don't know when your money's coming. We've historically, a lot of friendship centers have historically kept staff on because
finish your sentence.
because of the, anticipated funding, but when it gets to this point, you don't know.
Okay, thanks. Next question from Elena Lockhart, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's been very helpful. One of the things that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission suggested was that we recognize the value of Aboriginal healing practices. I'm assuming that's challenging in an off-reserve situation. Could you give us some sense of where you're at?
I don't find it challenging. I know a lot, and this is the thing, Canadians, or a lot of Canadians, we have this, and even in my own province, we have this idea that Indigenous people live on reserve, that's where they all are. They don't think that I have access to an elder who's lived in St. John's for 40 years and speaks Inuktitut and is able to communicate traditionally, and that I don't have access to those people, when we do. Most friendship centers have elders, cultural practices. A lot of friendship centers were hubs of cultural revitalization for a lot of people who left their communities. So a lot of friendship centers have language programming, cultural programming. Every program and service at most friendship centers, when they're developed from the ground up, have that lens of, is it culturally appropriate? Even a mental health team. Most people think of a mental health team as a, psychiatrist, clinical psychologist, whoever. Yet ours is clinical social worker, psychologist, cultural support workers who are there to be those people who support the cultural aspect of what they're going through, and an elder. So, I don't find it challenging. I know a lot of friendship centers don't find it challenging because there are a lot of Aboriginal people who live in the city, and there's a lot of Aboriginal elders who live in the city that you can call up and say, please come in, we want to do a ceremony, or please come in, we'd like to do this. So it isn't challenging. I think the challenging part is sometimes finding innovative ways to do it in the city, but totally possible. A lot of us, our founders, are now elders, and so it's a common thought that it's challenging or difficult. But we have third generation young people who've never lived on a reserve or an Aboriginal community. When a young person from Halifax looked at me and said, don't ask me where my community is. My community is Halifax. That's where I'm from. I'm an Indigenous person, but I live in Halifax. I'm like, okay, duly noted.
Great. It's a small question, but could be fairly broad. Going through this review and while we study this topic, is there one thing that you would say don't do for the federal government?
I think don't assume that something is going to work for everyone. One of my biggest things I like to tell people is, I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad I'm able to be here and talking for the National Association of Friendship Centers because the urban piece is really important. But real consultation, really understanding the differences between communities and that different things are going to be required depending on where you live and depending on the cultural background. There are, cultural practices, there are cultural beliefs around, when your life ends. there are all these different pieces, and just not to think that you're going to come up with something that will work for every single Indigenous person in this country, and that some of the best resources that you may have at your disposal are some of the regional people through your departments that know some communities and know and have amazing relationships. And so realize that, yes, it's great that I'm here and I can speak to some Friendship Center experiences, but those will be different depending on where you are, what cultural background is there, and what some of the makeup is. There are communities where homelessness might not be one of the factors. But I think you have to look at suicide as the combination of a whole bunch of different complex issues. Friendship Center is trying to meet as many of them in the wraparound pieces that we do. But I know, for instance, St. John's doesn't do employment services. We don't have that program. So that's an area where it's a huge concern. So I think looking at it and using as many of the regional resources that there are is really important.
Thank you. As a fellow Maritimer, I can appreciate that.
Atlantic, that's right. Sorry.
I would think saying that the flexibility is important, as Chris alluded to. I mean, we all know that programs are designed by governments for specific purposes, but flexibility on the recipient and the community, the one delivering the service, is a very important. And I think across the Friendship Center movement now, going on 60 years of experience in meeting needs directly and adapting services. So I think it's a fairly low risk proposition to allow that flexibility.
Okay. Thanks for that. Just before we get to the 3-minute question from Nikki Ashton, I just wanted to let members know that by the consent that we had at the beginning of the meeting, once Ms. Ashton has done her 3-minute question, we'll have a 7-minute question from Don Rusnak, a 7-minute question from David Yurdiga, and a 7-minute question from Nikki Ashton, and then we'll end the session with the association at that time. Okay, Ms. Ashton, please.
Great, thank you very much. I do want to revisit the discussion around the fact that your funding hasn't been renewed yet. I mean, I'm pretty alarmed to hear about that. Again, there are 4 Friendship Centers in our constituency. I mean, it's the only place for young people. In many cases, I mean, there's very important programming that's going on. And while I appreciate that you've submitted the papers as you've been asked to do, I mean, we are talking about 2 months in, and so this whole discussion around suicide and the great work you do, all of that stuff. I mean, really, if at the end of the day we're talking about you not having the fund or Friendship Centers not having the funding that they require to do the programming that's necessary, we've got a real problem on our hands. So I'm wondering if perhaps, and given that this round, there's such little time, if you could tell us what you're hearing from Friendship Centers on the ground in terms of the sense of urgency for this situation to be remedied, I mean, immediately.
So I work with all the Friendship Centers in the Atlantic region, so I hear it every day. I know we had a technical call yesterday, and a lot of the regional people were saying that they are hearing a lot of the Friendship Center's concerns as well. And for me, it goes back to, the shift in Friendship Center funding. It used to be simple. This is Friendship Center funding. It's there. It will continue to be there. It was a permanent program of the government, and that was it. I mean, there were modest delays back then, but not as much when you're redoing funding and it has to be drawn down again and it's sunsetting. And that's the huge difference between previous programs that we've had and the new programs that exist now, is that it's not just about, okay, this is being renewed. It's all the other intricacies of a new program that was not just for Friendship Centers and not just for core funding, and these are the things you're able to do. And so because of the fundamental shift, it is really a lot more complex, and it is affecting Friendship Centers today and yesterday. How many organizations do anyone know in this room that could bankroll sometimes 30 staff without any core funding, or even 5 staff? Not a lot of organizations have that capacity to be able to keep that going, and the longer it goes, the more challenging it is. And then you have to make tough decisions. You're bound by, labor laws and other legal pieces that, if you have to lay someone off, there are other implications than just shutting your doors. And so it is a challenge, and we are hearing about it.
I think we're out of time there, Nikki. Thanks. So we're going to go back to the 7-minute questions, and the first of the 3 is from Don Resnick.
Perfect. Well, thanks for coming before the committee again. I know you guys were here previously, and the Friendship Centers in my communities do an amazing job. I have 3 in my communities, but only 2 in my riding. But I know they do amazing work, and I've worked with workers in the court worker program in Thunder Bay. But I'm not aware of any work either. So we have a Friendship Center in Thunder Bay. That's one that's in my community, but it's not in my riding. One in Atikokan and one in Fort Francis. So the Northwestern Ontario, I'm sure you're familiar. I'm not aware of any work they're doing in suicide prevention now. I have met with people at the, of course, I'm familiar with people from the Thunder Bay Friendship Center and the Atikokan Friendship Center. I have yet to meet with people from the Fort Francis Center. Is there any examples that you can give from that area of the country, the work that they're doing in terms of suicide prevention?
So I've been to Kenora. One of my best friends is from Fort Francis, who was the president of our Aboriginal Youth Council when I was on the Youth Council. She was heavily involved when we did our strategic plan, and suicide prevention came up as a huge issue. The thing is that we couldn't get anyone to really fund it. What we had a plan, and what was developed over time was where we could have young people in each of the Friendship Centers trained, so that if young people in their communities were going through this, that they would have someone trained. And that was the gist of, when we asked the young people who were involved in Friendship Centers across the country, what were your priority areas? Suicide was one of them. And so we did as much as we could at the time, and it was 2010, 2011, wrote a proposal, did a launch for a suicide prevention toolkit and some other pieces, but we weren't able to get any traction on it. So, and this is the thing, depending on what community you're in, if you have support that you can access, it's really challenging. But a huge piece of that effort was led by the president at the time, who was from the Fort Francis Center.
So are you aware of any programs that are operating anywhere else in Ontario and are successful?
I'm not aware of any specifically. I could always ask, reach out to the Ontario Federation and see and this is the thing, every region is different, and every Friendship Center, because every Friendship Center has an independent board, voluntarily elected by their communities. And so unless it's a provincial-wide program, you would have to reach out to each center and ask them what they're doing.
I'm just going to switch gears a little bit. I'm a big fan of collaboration. So I'm familiar with the Thunder Bay Center, and I know the court workers collaborate with other workers at the courthouse to provide the services, the amazing services they do in Thunder Bay. But in terms of suicide prevention across Friendship Centers, or if you know of any examples of cooperation towards suicide prevention that the centers are engaging in, and if that can be shared with the committee, any best practices.
I think our biggest example was the youth piece. They came together. It represents young people from every region. They came together to build this piece and to reach out across the country and try to find that common piece with all of them. That was the biggest, and it was all led by young people. And they reached out to other young people, found out that this was a huge concern, worked really hard to build proposals and toolkits and everything else. That's the biggest collaboration I know of within Friendship Centers, because it was made up of so many young people from every region. One of the best parts about having a network of Friendship Centers is a lot of times if you're dealing with a serious issue or something really intense, you can reach out to another center that does that kind of work. So I know some centers have reached out to us and the center where I work about what do you do around this issue, and how do you get people trained, and what does this look like? I trained with some people when I was trained from Saskatchewan. So at any number or any given time, a Friendship Center may be reaching out to another center. But it is challenging to find a program or something where you can do something at this level in every center or across the country. And so it's been fractured.
And certainly at the national office, part of that job of the coordination is information sharing, best practice sharing through our communications across the network of friendship centers. So that's something we do quite often. We profile various interventions that are successful. And as Chris alluded to, I mean, our provincial territorial folks tend to have the relationship with the provincial ministries and provincial governments. And again, that support varies as well.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
You've still got 2 minutes.
Okay. In your view, how can friendship centers support the movement towards community-driven approaches and strategies in the design and delivery of mental health and suicide services?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I have a bit of a cold I'm fighting off, and that's why I grabbed the earpiece. I can barely hear too. In your view, how can friendship centers support the movement towards community-driven approaches and strategies in the design and delivery of mental health and suicide prevention services?
Well, I think if there was a strategic approach by the government to look at mental health and suicide, and that it was, say, multi-jurisdictional or even, they're interdepartmental, and then you invite people to the table who do, like, whether it's NAFC or whether it's friendship centers, and just say, like, we can reach out to all of those centers. We have the ability to reach out to all of them. And so if there's a strategy or an organized effort towards a certain area, or even for feedback, we are able to reach out to those 118 friendship centers pretty quickly and say, like, what are you doing? What works? We've looked at other programs that we've done to try to look at expanding them and taking them out across the country because they've been so successful. And so I think, one of the best things would be to engage with people who can reach those community members and to say, is there an amazing, suicide prevention program that really works in your community? For us, a big thing is having everyone trained so they know what to do. When someone walks to your door and there's a risk of suicide, what do you do? Who do you call? And so reaching out and, say, using the NAFC to reach out to those centers would be very beneficial.
And we're out of time there, Don. Thanks. The next question is for David Yurdigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be sharing some of my time, a small portion of it, with Kathy McLeod. Moving on. I noticed that the youth participation in regards to attending a lot of programs in various communities. I have a feeling that the youth want to get in touch with their past as far as cultural programming goes. So are you aware of any programs that deal with cultural issues, or not issues, but cultural programming that deal with therapies and traditional medicines?
So I think if you go into most friendship centers' youth programs, the reason they're so successful, and we've tried to say this, in any way possible, that having a young Indigenous person be confident in who they are as an Indigenous person and knowing their culture makes them significantly more successful. If you have a young Indigenous person who isn't comfortable with who they are as a person and they go to school and they're, singled out as the Indigenous person in school, or conversations come up, there's a huge struggle there. And so for a lot of friendship centers, when you're working with young people, that is a huge piece of everything that's developed, is what are the traditional practices? What are your traditional histories? We have young people in friendship centers that are the ones presenting to high schools or businesses or community groups about who they are as Indigenous people, what that looks like, some of the history, and some of the current pieces, because I think all of us sometimes get caught up in Indigenous people as like we were something of the past, or, we don't talk about the modern Indigenous person and what that looks like. But focusing and making sure culture is integrated into everything that young people do at friendship centers is really important. The reason I got involved with the National Association of Friendship Centers was because at their annual assembly, 1/3 of the vote is young people. 1/3 of the voting power at our national AGM is young people. And you can't proxy a youth vote. It has to be a young person. So we take that piece very seriously, and we do know that there is a huge correlation to when young Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, are really confident in who they are and their culture. It makes a huge difference. And so There are plenty of examples when young people are involved in social enterprises. They tend to want to take a cultural piece to it. You know, some examples in British Columbia of a chocolate business. But a part of the thing about having the chocolates is reading traditional folklore on the box, some of their legends that, you know, that are really important to them. Young people who create candle businesses that have traditional medicines used with them. So all these things have that lens because a lot of these young people have worked very hard to reconnect with who they are.
Okay, I have one more question, then I'll let Kathy take the next questions. How many minutes? Oh, good. Okay, are there any solutions or best practices to integrate a cultural-based approach to mental health and suicide prevention?
I think realizing that there's a place for a clinical side and there's a place for a traditional and cultural side, and that those things don't have to be separate. We have examples where Friendship Centers programs or their mental health programs are more preferred than a clinical option. You know, it's hard enough for an Aboriginal person to walk into a hospital. Can you imagine the barrier to walking into, say, a mental health emergency room? Because you don't feel confident or comfortable or understood, and so they'll more likely walk into a Friendship Center to talk about those things. And so I think looking at that there is a clinical side and there is a cultural side, and those things should work together. And a lot of Friendship Centers do this with a bunch of different programs, that there needs to be the respect and the understanding of both, and that you can do both, and they're not mutually exclusive. We, you know, have seen programs where there are Aboriginal patients in hospitals and Friendship Center staff working in those hospitals, or Friendship Centers that have clinics. The cultural piece is respected and understood, whether that's you want to smudge or you want to do a cultural ceremony, but realizing that there's an opportunity for the clinical piece too. And that there can be spaces for those things to happen, and they could be amazing. And to sit across from someone who understands you as an Indigenous person and still understands some of the mental health or suicide prevention pieces is huge. Instead of walking into a hospital hoping that someone's not going to ask you a horrible question. And so I think some of the best practices are that they can coexist. The clinical work and cultural work can coexist, and that is great.
2 minutes at that point right there, if you'd like to switch. Sorry to cut you off.
Thank you, Chair. And Chair very equally. The Mental Health Commission of Canada was given the task of adapting, I guess, the mental health first aid program to be much more culturally sensitive. So I appreciate that every community is different, and you need to hit that balance between the community needs versus maybe some good standardized program support that work. So I guess my first question is have you had any involvement with that particular initiative?
I have some experience with mental health first aid, but not in its adaptation. I think there should be space, because we all know that certain things have to be standardized and we need to be able to do certain things. But I think an important thing is looking at what Yancey had said, that it's not so restrictive that on the ground you can't adapt it within a margin to make sure that it meets the needs. We've seen this with other programs, and even with cultures. There are so many unique Indigenous cultures in this country. And I try to explain to people, when we develop programs, sometimes it's like, okay, like what does this mean for an Inuit person? What does this mean for a Mi'kmaq person? What does this mean for a Métis person? But to have the ability to adapt and be flexible enough to change that should you need to. But that, at the end of the day, the development is there. One thing I always try to remind people when we're, culturally adapting things, and, it's important to go back to the basics. What makes mental health first aid important? What makes that successful? And are there any core pieces of that may need to be adjusted?
So I guess to date, none of the Friendship Centers have been involved with that process?
We've been involved in at national policy discussions and development of the strategy with the Commission, but perhaps not at the individual Friendship Center level.
Shepard,
We're out of time, Kathy, there.
Oh, really?
I'm so sorry. Yes. Take it up with David. Final question from Nikki Ashton, please.
Thank you. Obviously, as you will know, that the point of this study is to come up with some pretty robust recommendations to prevent suicide among Indigenous peoples and communities. And one issue that that I know from back home that often either gets talked about in other ways or gets overlooked, in part because the immediate needs are so significant, that crisis response is so critical, is the need to tackle poverty. And I'm wondering if you can speak in a way that obviously we can pull from that a recommendation. How important is it to tackle poverty when we're talking about the end goal of ending suicide and putting an end to suicide epidemics, and what could we be doing about that, and perhaps particularly in the context of urban centers and urban Indigenous communities?
Poverty comes in so many different shapes and forms. Urban Indigenous people and, say, homelessness, unless you're a shelter, it's almost an invisible problem because they're probably on a friend's couch or somewhere else and they may not have sustainable housing. It is made up of there's so many facets to the poverty piece and suicide. It's really hard to tackle poverty when you talk to a person and, it's like, get a job. Well, saying, look for a job is one thing, but how do you get a job when you have multiple barriers? You have a criminal record, you don't have a lot of training, you may have other barriers. And it comes down to, why we do things the way we do them. Like, why do we offer transportation? Why do we have a homeless shelter? Why do we offer, youth programming, daycare, whatever we need to offer? Because it's so challenging for an Indigenous person to get, for an average Canadian to walk into, say, an employment center. We all know of employment centers. You walk in, fill out your information, get some support, get some training. An Aboriginal person or an Indigenous person will not walk into an organization that they don't feel safe and start disclosing all these things. I'm homeless. I don't have my children. My children were taken away. I have an addiction. I have a criminal. They're not going to tell just anyone that. And so when we look at an individual, it's like, okay, and we say like suicide is an immediate risk type thing and it's an immediate thing you have to solve. But so is glasses. So is being able to see. So is not having your medication. So is not having food to put on your table. There are all these things, and it's like we try to tackle them one thing at a time, meet the immediate risk there. But poverty is real. Poverty for Indigenous people in urban centers is a real thing, and we see it every day. It's why friendship centers have food banks. It's why we have clothing that people can pick up. It's why we have homeless shelters. And you see it, and it's real. And, we talk about how hard it is for housing. Well, add in everything else. Good luck getting a credit check for an apartment. Good luck passing some of those pieces. And I've had people denied housing when they were asked, are you Aboriginal? Yes. Well, actually, the damage deposit is now twice that, and you have to provide this much more because I'm not sure if I can rent to you. So you have all these huge things that make up the poverty piece that is about, okay, how do you offer as many things as you can? And it's why friendship centers have gotten so innovative with, okay, we'll do daycare, we'll do transportation, we'll help you get a job, we'll do whatever it takes. Because sometimes you can't even refer an Aboriginal person to another service provider because they probably won't go. They might go if you go with them. And it's no different than, walking into a hospital because you're at immediate risk of dying by suicide. So you walk in the door and you're lucky if you don't get handed a piece of paper and said, call these numbers. So poverty is more than, you don't make enough money. It's all these things combined and that we see every day. And it's really challenging to explain that to a lot of people because people think of poverty as the person sitting on the street. Someone seems like they might have everything they need, but they don't. They're not able to provide for themselves or their family, and that's a reality. And until you can really look at, okay, it takes a healthy person, a job, resources, somewhere to sleep, And so, I mean, when you're constantly dealing with somewhere to sleep, something to eat, being able to, and seeing is like, you know, it's crazy to think that you have clients who can't even see because they can't get glasses. And that is a real barrier. And so suicide is an immediate risk factor, housing is an immediate risk factor. There are all these things, but, you know, infrastructure is a huge thing. But not just like, here's a house. It's like saying, here's a job. At Friendship Centers, like, we can get you a job any day. That's awesome. However, it's what happens from 5 till 9 the next morning, or with your family or other concerns. So you need the ability to provide those supports. Do you have someone you can call 24 hours a day? You're not going to make it to work tomorrow, and you'll lose your job, then you'll lose your housing, and it goes one after the next. So for us, it's like, don't just provide the money. It's like, say, here's money to buy a car, but no money to maintain it. Here's the money to open a youth center, but no money to run it. And poverty is like that. It's like, yes, it would be great to have the infrastructure money to do that, but you also need the money to provide the services that support people until they're able to do it themselves.
Yeah, I would also add on that, from a policy perspective, I think focusing on supporting labor market development for Friendship Centres. We're not currently delivering outside of Ontario Aboriginal labor market programming from the federal government. And also, and this affects a lot of charities generally, is the ability to have a for-profit enterprise. So a lot of Friendship Centres are working on social enterprise, creating own source revenue while creating jobs for multi-barriered clients. And that's something that at the national level and with a lot of Friendship Centres we're doing through our Indigenous Innovation Summit, trying to build that field of Indigenous social enterprise and social innovation.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. We've come to the end. Mr. Shepherd, Mr. Craig, thanks so much for traveling from near and far to be with us today, and for sharing your experience and knowledge so compellingly. It'll be very constructive for us as we move ahead with this very important study. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We will suspend for about 2 minutes and then come back in camera. you.